The morning of November 20th, 1943, near the Sangro River in eastern Italy, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the churned mud glistening under a pale sun that offered no warmth. Tenente Marco Rossetti of the 132nd Armored Division Ariete crouched beside the hulk of an American M4 Sherman tank, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The tank was a ruin, its right track blown apart, 3 jagged holes punched through its hull where German 88mm rounds had found their mark. Scorch marks blackened the turret. By every measure, Rossetti understood this should have been a tomb. Yet as he peered through the commander's hatch, he saw something that made no sense. The interior, though damaged, showed no signs of the catastrophic crew deaths he'd witnessed in dozens of Italian M14 over 41 tanks. No blood splattered across the walls. No bodies trapped in twisted metal. The ammunition racks, he noticed, were built into the floor and surrounded by strange water-filled jackets. The escape hatch in the hull floor hung open. Someone had gotten out, possibly everyone. Rossetti had spent 3 years watching Italian tank crews die. He'd pulled charred bodies from riveted hulls, where a single penetrating shot turned the fighting compartment into an incinerator. He'd seen men trapped by hatches too small to squeeze through, while flames consumed them. He'd heard the screaming. And now, examining this burned American tank, he confronted a truth that challenged everything the Italian Royal Army had taught him about armored warfare. The Americans had designed their tanks expecting them to be destroyed. They'd built them so their men could survive. This script will explore the profound irony at the heart of World War II tank design, how the Italian focus on the tank as a weapon of national pride produced machines that killed their own crews, while the American emphasis on industrial pragmatism and crew welfare created what many dismissed as inferior tanks, but which brought their soldiers home alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By late 1943, when Marco Rossetti examined Sherman near the Sangro River, Italian tank doctrine had already been written in blood across the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Sicily. The Royal Italian Army had entered World War II in June 1940 with a tank force that looked impressive on paper, hundreds of medium tanks, thousands of light tankettes, all bearing the proud designation Carro Armato, armoured carriage. But beneath the martial terminology lay a technological philosophy that would prove catastrophic for the men who crewed them. The M13 over 40 and its successor, the M14 over 41, represented Italy's primary medium tanks throughout the war. These 13 to 14-ton vehicles mounted a 47mm gun in a fully rotating turret, a significant improvement over earlier Italian designs. With armour ranging from 25 to 42mm thick, they appeared comparable to contemporary British cruiser tanks and early Soviet designs. The Italian High Command spoke confidently of achieving parity with their enemies. But the men who fought in these machines knew a different truth. The M14 over 41's hull was riveted, not welded, a construction method that turned every penetrating hit into a storm of shrapnel as rivets sheared off inside the fighting compartment. The tank's bottom armour was a mere 6mm thick, offering virtually no protection against mines. When Lieutenant Rossetti's unit had advanced across the tank-strewn battlefield at El Alamein in October 1942, he'd counted 34 destroyed Italian tanks in a single kilometre. Inside several, the crews were still at their positions, killed not by the initial penetration but by their own tank's construction turning against them. The interior of an M14 over 41 was a study in compromised space. 4 men driver, hull, machine gunner, commander, and gunner worked in a compartment that measured less than 6 meters long and barely 2 meters wide at its broadest point. The driver, positioned on the left front, had only a single overhead hatch measuring 30 centimeters square. To exit, he had to pull himself straight up through an opening smaller than his shoulders, often while the tank was filling with smoke or flames. The hull gunner on the right had an identical hatch. Neither man could reach the other's escape route. In the turret, conditions were worse. The commander and gunner shared a cramped space dominated by the breech of the 47mm gun, the recoil mechanism, ammunition racks, and the turret traverse system. A single hatch, roughly 40 centimeters in diameter, provided the only exit for both men. In combat, with the commander standing to observe, through his periscope, and the gunner seated at his station, neither could reach the hatch without the other moving first. When an 88mm shell penetrated the turret, and German guns could do so from ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, there was rarely time for even one man to escape. The Italian tankers developed gallows humor about their situation. They called the M14/41 the tin coffin, or self-lighting cigarette. These weren't jokes. They were accurate descriptions. When American intelligence officers interviewed captured Italian tank crews in Tunisia during the spring of 1943, they compiled sobering statistics. Of Italian tanks destroyed by direct fire, fewer than half the crew escaped. When ammunition fires erupted, which occurred in roughly 70% of penetrating hits, survival rates dropped below 20%. The average Italian tank crewman who saw combat in North Africa had a life expectancy measured in weeks, but the tragedy wasn't simply that Italian tanks burned. Almost every tank of that era, when penetrated, faced catastrophic fire risk. The British Matilda and Crusader tanks brewed up regularly. Early American Shermans earned the bitter nickname Ronson from their tendency to ignite. Even German Panzer III and IVs could become furnaces when hit in the right place. What distinguished the Italian experience was that their tanks offered virtually no chance of escape once fire began. Consider the fuel system. Italian tanks used diesel engines theoretically safer than gasoline. But the fuel tanks in the M14/41 were positioned in the fighting compartment's lower sponsons, directly adjacent to the crew. A penetrating hit that struck these tanks would spray diesel fuel across the hot metal of the breech and engine compartment barrier, where it would ignite within seconds. The flames would fill the crew compartment before reaching the engine bay. The crew's first indication of fire was often the moment it engulfed them. Ammunition storage compounded the problem. Ready rounds, the shells immediately available for combat, were stored in racks around the turret base, completely exposed. A single penetrating hit that struck these rounds would detonate them in a cascading explosion. The German and British tankers who examined destroyed Italian tanks after battles reported finding turrets blown completely off their ring bearings, thrown 3 or 4 meters from the hull. No crew could survive such detonations. Italian tank designers weren't ignorant or malicious. They faced constraints that would have challenged any nation. Italy's industrial capacity was a fraction of Germany's, Britain's, or America's. The country lacked the steel production, machine tool availability, and manufacturing expertise to produce tanks on the scale or quality of its enemies. When Italian factories attempted to introduce welded hull construction in 1942, they found their welding equipment and trained workforce inadequate for the task. Riveting was what the Italian industry knew, so riveting continued. But beyond industrial limitations lay a more fundamental problem. Italian military doctrine treated tanks as weapons platforms first and crew vehicles second. This wasn't unique to Italy. Most nations in the 1930s designed tanks primarily to destroy enemy vehicles and support infantry. Crew welfare, while considered, took lower priority than firepower, armor, and speed. The Germans, British, and Soviets all produced early war tanks with cramped interiors, poor escape routes, and fire-prone ammunition storage. What separated the Americans was their willingness to learn and adapt. By mid-1943, when US forces began landing in Sicily, they brought with them tanks that embodied a radically different philosophy, one that Marco Rossetti would discover when he examined that ruined Sherman near the Sangro River. The M4 Sherman that Rossetti examined that, November morning represented the culmination of American armored doctrine developed over 3 years of rapid evolution. When the first Sherman prototypes rolled off production lines in February 1942, they incorporated lessons the US Army had learned watching German panzers devastate Poland and France. But more importantly, they reflected a characteristically American approach to military equipment. Build it reliable, build it maintainable, build it so the crew can survive when things go wrong. From the outside, the Sherman appeared ordinary enough, a boxy, tall profile that many criticized as too visible. It weighed 33 tons, mounted a 75mm gun, and carried 5 crew members. Its armor, 50.8mm on the glacis plate, 76mm on the turret front, was adequate against most German and Italian anti-tank weapons of 1942, but increasingly vulnerable by 1943. In raw combat capability, it didn't overwhelm its opponents. But inside, the Sherman was different. Rossetti noticed it immediately as he examined the wreck. Space. The fighting compartment was enormous compared to his M14/41. The driver and co-driver, positioned in the front hull, had room to move their arms freely. Their overhead hatches were large, initially 30 centimeters, but enlarged to 45 centimeters in newer models. Spring-loaded hinges made them easy to throw open even when the crewman was injured or weak. The driver could exit his position in under 5 seconds when practiced. More striking was the floor escape hatch. Positioned directly behind the co-driver, this hatch measured roughly 40 centimeters square and opened downward. In combat, crews used it to dispose of spent shell casings, but its real purpose became clear when the tank was hit. It provided an escape route that didn't require exposing oneself to enemy fire. Tank crews could drop through it, roll under the tank, and crawl to safety while the vehicle's bulk shielded them. In the Pacific Theater, American Marines had even used this hatch in reverse, driving over wounded infantrymen and pulling them up into the tank's protected interior while under Japanese fire. The turret design revealed similar priorities. The commander, gunner, and loader worked in a space that seemed wasteful by Italian standards, nearly twice the volume of an M14/41's turret. But this space meant crew members could move past each other. When the commander stood in his hatch to observe, the gunner could still traverse and fire. When the loader needed to reach ammunition, he didn't have to climb over the gunner. Most critically, both the commander and loader had their own overhead hatches. If the tank was hit and the turret jammed, both men could exit simultaneously without blocking each other's escape. American designers were obsessed over escape routes. They'd studied British after-action reports from North Africa. They'd interviewed survivors of tank battles. They'd run tests, dropping dummies through hatches to measure exit times. Every iteration of the Sherman incorporated improvements: larger hatches, better hinge mechanisms, additional escape routes. By late 1943, Sherman crews were escaping from knocked-out tanks at rates that astounded even their own commanders. But the escape hatches were only half the story. What truly distinguished the Sherman was what Rossetti discovered when he examined the ammunition storage. In early Shermans, ammunition had been stored, much like in Italian tanks, in racks around the turret base and in the sponsons. These tanks burned at horrifying rates. Studies showed that between 60 and 80% of Shermans hit by penetrating fire erupted in flames as ammunition cooked off. Tank crews gave their vehicles bitter nicknames: Ronson, Zippo, Tommy Cooker. The psychological impact was devastating. Men who survived one burning tank often refused to crew another. The U.S. Ordnance Department responded with characteristic pragmatism. If the tanks were going to burn, they'd eliminate the cause. Beginning in February 1944, Sherman production shifted to wet stowage ammunition storage. The redesign was simple but transformative. Ammunition racks were moved from the turret and sponsons down to armored boxes in the hull floor. Each box was surrounded by water-filled jackets, glycerin water solution in sealed containers. When a shell penetrated and hit the ammunition, the water jackets would rupture, flooding the space and preventing fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Wet stowage Shermans, identifiable by a W in their designation like M4, a 375W, showed fire rates dropping from 70% to 15%. Later models with improved water jacket designs reduced it further to 10%. A crew in a wet stowage Sherman hit by an 88mm round had better than even odds their tank wouldn't burn. And if it didn't burn, they had time to use those well-designed escape hatches. But wet stowage didn't reach combat units until mid-1944, months after American forces landed in Italy. The Sherman that Rossetti examined near the Sangro River in November 1943 would have had the older dry storage, yet the crew had still escaped. Why? The answer lay in details that emerged only from close examination. The Sherman's electrical system included a backup generator, a 550-watt home-light auxiliary unit mounted in the hull. This generator could power the tank's electrical systems, including turret traverse, even when the main engine was dead. German and Italian tanks required their engines running to operate their turrets. If a Sherman's engine was knocked out but the crew remained alive, they could still rotate the turret using the backup power, potentially bringing their gun to bear on whoever had hit them while preparing to evacuate. This bought precious seconds. The Sherman also carried 4 fire extinguishers, 2 10-pound carbon dioxide units with triggers inside the tank, and 2 4-pound portable units that crew members could grab as they evacuated. Italian tanks typically had 1 or 2 extinguishers total. The difference in a burning tank was often the difference between having time to open a hatch and dying at one's station. Even the interior lighting reflected this priority on crew welfare. The Sherman had 4 or 5 dome lights in the fighting compartment, allowing crew members to see clearly even when all hatches were closed. Italian tanks typically had 1 or 2 lights. When smoke filled an M14 over 41's interior after a hit, the crew was functionally blind. Sherman crews at least had a chance to see their escape routes. These features large hatches, floor escapes, backup power, multiple fire extinguishers. Good lighting individually seemed minor. Collectively, they represented a design philosophy. Assume the tank will be hit and destroyed, so build it to save the crew. The Americans understood something that Italian, German, and even British designers initially missed. In modern industrialized warfare, the tank was replaceable. The factory in Detroit or Chicago could build another Sherman in the time it took to train a replacement crew. But the crew, 5 men with weeks or months of training, combat experience, unit cohesion, they were the actual weapon. The tank was just the tool that let them fight. If the tool broke but the crew survived, you could give them a new tool tomorrow. If the crew died, you'd wasted months of training and lost irreplaceable combat experience. This philosophy manifested in other ways. Sherman crews trained extensively on emergency procedures. They practiced evacuating their tanks while blindfolded. They drilled on fighting fires. They learned to identify the sound of different weapons striking their armor so they'd know immediately when they'd been hit and what had hit them. American doctrine emphasized crew survival not as a humane luxury, but as a tactical necessity. The statistics bore this out. By late 1943, American tankers were reporting crew casualty rates of approximately 1 man killed and 1 wounded per tank destroyed. British forces using Shermans reported similar figures. Polish armoured units equipped with Shermans found that on average, 5 tanks were destroyed for every tank crew killed, meaning most crews survived multiple vehicles being shot out from under them. These weren't propaganda figures. They came from unit medical records and after-action reports. Compare this to Rossetti's experience. In the 132nd Armoured Division, Ariete's final actions at El Alamein in October 1942, the unit reported losing over 100 M13 over 40 and M14 over 41 tanks in sustained combat. Crew casualties exceeded 300 dead and wounded. That was 3 men killed, or wounded per tank destroyed triple the American rate. And this ratio didn't account for tanks destroyed so thoroughly that casualty counts were impossible. As Rossetti crouched beside that destroyed Sherman, running his hand along the interior where the armor had been penetrated, he understood why this American tank had empty crew seats. The holes where German rounds had struck were clean punches through the armor. Solid shot had entered, tumbled through the interior, and exited. Terrible damage, certainly. But the ammunition hadn't exploded. The fuel hadn't ignited immediately. The crew had perhaps 10 or 15 seconds of warning as systems failed. And in those seconds, they'd had large hatches within arm's reach, a floor hatch below them, interior lighting to see their way through the smoke, and enough space to move past each other without becoming tangled. In an M14/41 hit the same way, at least 3 of the 4 crew would have died before they could reach their 2 small hatches. The rivets would have turned the interior into a killing box. The ammunition would have cooked off within seconds. The survivors, if any, would have been catastrophically burned or wounded, trying to squeeze through openings designed before anyone understood what tank combat actually demanded. The irony was profound. Italian propaganda portrayed the Sherman as a crude, mass-produced box American quantity over quality. German tankers dismissed them as Tommy Cookers and 33-tonners unworthy of respect. But the men who designed the Sherman had understood something more fundamental than armor thickness or gun caliber. The battle didn't end when the tank was hit. It ended when the crew was dead or had escaped. Everything about the Sherman's interior design prioritized keeping that endpoint as far in the future as possible. This wasn't sentiment. It was cold arithmetic. Each trained tank crew represented months of investment in schools, training grounds, fuel, and ammunition. Every crew that survived a knocked-out tank could crew a replacement vehicle the next day, bringing their combat experience forward. The Sherman's survivability features weren't charity, they were force multiplication. A crew that survived 4 tanks being shot out from under them became 4 times as valuable as a crew that died in their first engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Italian army had approached tank design from the opposite direction. Their tanks were conceived as weapons platforms, mobile gun systems meant to deliver firepower to the battlefield. Crew accommodation was secondary. This made sense in the context of Italy's limited industrial capacity and the armoured doctrine of the 1930s. But by 1943, as Rossetti examined evidence that contradicted every assumption his training had taught him, that doctrine lay in ruins alongside the destroyed tanks that had embodied it. The full weight of this disparity became clear to Italian tankers, not through statistical analysis, but through the grinding reality of combat in Sicily and mainland Italy. When American forces landed on Sicily's southern beaches on July 10, 1943, they brought with them approximately 400 Sherman tanks. The Italian defenders, still reeling from catastrophic losses in North Africa, fielded a mixture of obsolete Fiat 3000 tanks from the First World War, L6 over 40 light tanks, and a dwindling number of M14 over 41 mediums. The Germans provided Panzer III and IV tanks, but Italian crews were relegated to their own increasingly outmatched vehicles. The Battle of Gela, fought on July 11th through 14th, 1943, demonstrated the gulf between Italian and American armoured capabilities. The Livorno Division mustered 38 Fiat 3000 tanks and several semovente self-propelled guns for a counterattack against American beachheads. These World War I-era tanks, armed with 37mm guns and protected by 16mm of armour, advanced toward positions held by the 1st Infantry Division. American defenders included M4 Shermans, towed anti-tank guns, infantry with bazookas, and naval gunfire support from destroyers offshore. The Italian tanks were destroyed systematically. Of the 38 Fiat 3000 seconds committed, fewer than 5 returned to Italian lines. But here's what shocked the American troops who examined the wrecks. In many of the destroyed Italian tanks, the entire crew had perished. Tanks that had been penetrated by a single 75mm Sherman round or a 2.36-inch naval shell contained 3 dead men, their bodies bearing evidence that they'd been trapped inside when fire consumed the vehicle. American tank crews, by contrast, were routinely walking away from destroyed vehicles. A Sherman hit by an 88mm round from a German flak gun might be rendered combat ineffective, its engine destroyed, tracks blown off, armor penetrated. But when American recovery crews reached these wrecks hours later, they typically found them abandoned but not burned. The crew had evacuated through those large hatches and floor escapes. If the tank hadn't caught fire immediately, and wet stowage models increasingly didn't, there was time to get out. Captain James Murphy of the 67th Armoured Regiment, 2nd Armoured Division, kept a detailed diary of his experiences in Sicily and Italy. In an entry from September 19, 1943, shortly after landing at Salerno, he recorded, "Lost 2 tanks today to German anti-tank fire. First took a round through the turret at about 1400 hours. Saw the crew bail out within seconds, all 5 men accounted for. Johnson had a broken arm from the evacuation, but everyone else walked away. The second tank hit a mine at 1600. Blew the right track completely off and damaged the drive sprocket. The crew evacuated through the floor hatch and hull hatches. No injuries. Both tanks will be recovered tonight for repair." This wasn't propaganda. Murphy's diary, now archived at the National World War II Museum, contains dozens of similar entries. Tanks destroyed, crews surviving, the pattern repeated across American armoured units. The 3rd Armoured Division, which landed in Normandy in June 1944 and fought through to Germany, lost 648 Shermans, completely destroyed in combat, a 580% loss rate, meaning the average tank in the division was replaced nearly 6 times. Yet crew casualties totaled approximately 300 killed over the same period. Rough arithmetic suggests roughly 1 crewman killed for every 2 tanks destroyed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us and continue producing in-depth content like this. Italian tankers who survived to witness American operations in Italy during 1943 and 44 found themselves confronting a painful question. Why hadn't their own military-designed tanks with similar survivability features? The answer was complex, rooted in Italy's industrial limitations, doctrinal assumptions, and the specific historical path that led to war. When Italy began designing medium tanks in the late 1930s, the nation's armour theorists looked primarily to British and French examples. The Vickers medium tank, which had influenced designs across Europe, emphasised a balanced combination of firepower, armour, and speed. Italian designers adopted this philosophy for the M11/39 and its successor, the M13/40, but they made critical assumptions that would prove catastrophic. First, they assumed tank versus tank combat would occur at relatively close ranges, 500 to 1,000 meters, where Italian guns would be effective. This proved false. By 1941 in North Africa, British tanks were engaging Italian armour from ranges exceeding 2 kilometers using superior optics and range finding. The Italians found themselves being destroyed before they could return effective fire. Second, they assumed that armour sufficient to stop anti-tank rifles and light cannon 30 to 42 mm would provide adequate protection. This was reasonable in 1939. By 1942, every major combatant fielded anti-tank guns capable of penetrating 42 mm of armour from comfortable distances. The Italians couldn't thicken their armour without completely redesigning the chassis and exceeding their engine's power capacity. Third, and most critically, they assumed the tank crew was subordinate to the tank's combat function. This wasn't cruelty, it reflected military thinking common across Europe. Tanks existed to destroy enemy vehicles and support infantry. Crew comfort, ease of escape, interior space, these were luxuries to be pursued only after combat effectiveness was maximized. German tank designers shared this philosophy. So did Soviet designers. Even the British, despite better escape hatches than the Italians, packed their crews into cramped spaces that prioritized gun and ammunition storage over human ergonomics. The Americans arrived at their different conclusion partly through doctrine and partly through industrial culture. American armored doctrine, heavily influenced by cavalry traditions, viewed tanks as mobile fighting platforms for mounted troops. The crew wasn't operating the weapon, they were the weapon, using the tank as their horse. This subtle distinction led to design choices that prioritized crew effectiveness. A comfortable crew fought better. A crew that could escape and crew another tank maintained experience. The tank was expendable equipment. The soldiers were the actual combat asset. American industrial culture reinforced this. The United States had developed mass production techniques that made individual vehicles remarkably cheap to produce. A Sherman cost approximately $33,000 to manufacture in 1942, roughly $550,000 in modern money, but more importantly, roughly 1/2000th the cost of a B-17 bomber. American factories produced 49,324 Shermans between 1942 and 1945. Italy's entire wartime tank production totaled approximately 5,500 vehicles across all models. When American engineers realized their early Shermans were burning at unacceptable rates, they had the industrial capacity to redesign and retrofit. The wet stowage modification required extensive changes, relocating ammunition racks, adding water jacket systems, modifying turret basket floors, installing new electrical systems for the repositioned ammunition. This would have been nearly impossible for Italian industry to implement on existing tanks. For American industry, it was Tuesday. Sergeant Antonio Ferrara of the 32nd Tank Regiment experienced this disparity firsthand. Captured by British forces at El Alamein in November 1942, he spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Egypt, alongside other Italian tankers. In interviews conducted by Italian military historians in the 1950s, Ferrara described the psychological impact of learning about Sherman survivability features. "We heard from the guards that the Americans and British were losing tanks but not so many men," Ferrara recalled. "At first we thought this was propaganda, trying to make us feel worse about our defeats. But then we started receiving letters from home, and some of the men heard from relatives who'd seen the fighting in Sicily and Italy. They wrote about seeing knocked-out American tanks with the crews standing beside them, smoking cigarettes, waiting for recovery vehicles, knocked out, not destroyed. The crew is alive, not dead," Ferrara continued. "We began to understand that we had been lied to, or perhaps our officers simply didn't know. They told us our tanks were equal to the enemy's, that Italian armor and Italian guns were sufficient. They never told us that our tanks were designed to fight, not to protect us when the fighting went badly. When you realize you were sent into battle in a vehicle designed to be destroyed with you inside it, and at the same moment your enemy was riding in vehicles designed to let them escape, that's when you understand you weren't soldiers. You were ammunition." This bitter realization spread among Italian tankers during the latter half of 1943. The September armistice, which saw Italy switch sides and declare war on Germany, created a strange situation where former enemies examined each other's equipment side by side. Italian tank crews, who joined the Italian co-belligerent army, found themselves training on Allied vehicles, sometimes including Shermans. The contrast was overwhelming. Lieutenant Paolo Marchi, who had commanded an M14, 41 inches North Africa, before being wounded and evacuated to Italy, later trained on Sherman tanks provided to Italian units in 1944. In a letter to his family dated March 3, 1944, he wrote, "Today I entered an American tank for the first time. I cannot adequately express how different it is. The space inside is twice what I had in my M14. Each crew member has his own hatch. I have never seen such a thing. The commander showed me where the ammunition is stored, on the floor with water around it. He explained that even if the tank is hit and penetrated, the ammunition usually does not explode. I asked him how many times he had been in a tank that was hit. He said 3 times. 3 times. And he is still alive, still fighting. I was hit once, in my M14, and barely escaped with burns on my arms and face. If I had been hit 3 times, I would certainly be dead. The technical specifications made the disparity quantifiable. An M14/41 crew member, attempting to evacuate after the tank was penetrated, faced these constraints: locate the hatch in smoke-filled darkness, illuminated by 1 or 2 weak lights, open a hatch measuring 30 to 40 centimeters square, pull oneself through that opening while possibly injured, while the tank was likely filling with flame or toxic gas from burning propellant. Accomplish all this in roughly 5 to 10 seconds before ammunition, detonation, or fire made escape impossible. A Sherman crew member in the same situation had multiple large hatches within easy reach, a floor escape hatch usable by any crew member, 4 to 5 dome lights providing illumination, backup electrical power to operate turret systems, multiple fire extinguishers, and crucially, if the tank had wet stowage, 15 to 30 seconds before catastrophic fire 3 to 6 times longer than Italian tankers had. The evacuation time difference sounds small, perhaps 20 seconds versus 5 seconds, but in the desperate calculus of tank combat, those seconds meant the difference between 5 men dead and 5 men alive. And those men represented irreplaceable combat experience. The German military, with typical thoroughness, studied captured Sherman tanks extensively. A Waffenamt report from June 1944, examining a Sherman captured in Italy, noted, "The crew accommodation is significantly more spacious than in comparable German vehicles. Exit hatches are large and well positioned. The floor hatch represents an interesting emergency escape solution not present in German designs. Fire suppression equipment is more extensive than in Panzer IV or Panther tanks. Recommendation: investigate feasibility of similar crew survivability features in future German tank designs." That recommendation nowhere. German tank production was already at maximum capacity, using designs that had been finalized years earlier. Implementing major redesigns to improve crew survivability would have required months of engineering work and retooling of production facilities. The Germans, like the Italians, were committed to their existing designs by industrial inertia and battlefield necessity. They couldn't stop tank production to redesign for survivability when they desperately needed more tanks immediately. But the Germans at least recognized what they were missing. Italian military leadership, until the armistice, largely refused to acknowledge the problem. Official Italian army documents from 1942 and early 1943 make almost no mention of crew survivability as a design priority. Tank development reports focus on firepower improvements, the 47mm gun's penetration characteristics, attempts to mount larger weapons, and armor thickness. Crew evacuation procedures appear in training manuals as brief afterthoughts. In the event of catastrophic damage, crew members should attempt to evacuate the vehicle. No mention of how, through what hatches, in what order, or within what time frame. The institutional blindness wasn't universal. Lower-ranking officers who'd actually commanded tanks in combat wrote reports pleading for improved escape hatches, better fire suppression, and relocated ammunition storage. These reports moved up the chain of command and disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Italy's industrial capacity couldn't have implemented the changes even if the High Command had wanted them, and the High Command had other priorities. This institutional failure had names and faces. Sergeant Giuseppe Romano of the 131st Centauro Division died on November 23, 1942, when his M14/41 was struck by a British 2-pounder gun during a rearguard action near El Agheila. The penetrating round ignited ammunition stored around the turret base. Romano, the tank commander, was standing in his hatch. He could have jumped clear, but his gunner and loader, trapped below him, were blocking his exit as they tried to reach the single turret hatch. All 3 men died when the ammunition detonated, perhaps 5 seconds after the initial penetration. Romano's body was recovered by Italian forces. His diary, sent home to his family, contained an entry dated 2 weeks before his death. "We heard today that the British have new American tanks. The men say these tanks have many hatches, and the crews escape even when the tank is destroyed. I wish someone would explain to the generals that tanks can be built with hatches large enough for a man to escape through. My hatch is barely large enough for my head." Corporal Luigi Bianchi of the Ariete Division survived his tank being destroyed at El Alamein, but was so severely burned that he was evacuated to Italy and declared unfit for the further service. In testimony given to Italian military investigators in 1943, after the armistice, Bianchi described his escape. "The British tank shot us from perhaps 800 meters. I did not see the round coming, only the flash when it struck our right side. Immediately the driver was screaming. I think he was hit by fragments. The hull gunner tried to open his hatch, but it was jammed. I was the loader. I tried to reach the turret hatch, but the commander was already there, trying to get out. Then the ammunition began to cook off. I could hear the propellant bags starting to burn. I knew I had perhaps 3 seconds. I pushed the commander aside and forced myself through the hatch. It was too small. I tore my shoulder getting through, and my clothes caught fire. I rolled off the tank and into the sand. When I looked back, the tank was burning completely. The others did not get out. Multiply Bianchi's experience by hundreds, and you begin to understand the human cost of Italy's tank design philosophy. The Italian army lost approximately 5,000 tanks during World War II, destroyed, captured, or abandoned. If we assume a conservative estimate that 50% of knocked-out Italian tanks resulted in at least 1 crew death and average 2 deaths per destroyed tank, that's 5,000 men killed not by superior enemy firepower, but by inadequate escape provisions. 5,000 men who might have survived to crew another tank, to train replacements, to use their experience in later battles, to return home after the war. The Americans, by contrast, lost approximately 10,000 Shermans in combat in the European and Mediterranean theatres, combined roughly twice as many vehicles. But American tank crew deaths in those theatres totaled approximately 4,500. The ratios are stark. Italians lost 1 man per destroyed tank. Americans lost less than half a man per destroyed tank. Both armies faced similar weapons: German 88mm guns, Panzer IV and Panther tanks, anti-tank mines. The primary difference was what happened in the seconds after penetration. By late 1944, the pattern had become so clear that Allied intelligence included crew survivability statistics in their assessments of Axis tank effectiveness. A British 21st Army Group report from December 1944 noted, German tank crews show improving evacuation rates as commanders become more experienced in recognizing penetrating hits and ordering immediate evacuation. Italian tank crews, in cases where Italian-designed vehicles remain in use by German forces, continue to show high casualty rates per vehicle destroyed. This appears attributable to vehicle design rather than crew training. That final sentence was diplomatic British understatement for a brutal truth. Italian tanks killed their own crews. The turning point in understanding came not from high-level analysis, but from small moments of recognition scattered across the Italian battlefield. Lieutenant Rossetti's examination of that destroyed Sherman near the Sangro River was one such moment. Another occurred in February 1944, near the town of Cassino. American forces had been attempting to breach the German Gustav Line for months. The fighting around Monte Cassino involved sustained tank battles in mountainous terrain where concealed German anti-tank guns destroyed dozens of Allied vehicles. Staff Sergeant Thomas Bryant of the 756th Tank Battalion was commanding a Sherman that took a direct hit from a concealed Pak-40 anti-tank gun on February 15th. The round came through the right side of the turret, Bryant recalled in a post-war interview. Sounded like someone hit the tank with the world's biggest hammer. The gunner, Morrison, was killed instantly. The round came through right where he was sitting. I saw Lopez, the loader. He was already moving toward his hatch. I yelled to the driver and co-driver to bail out. The tank was still running, engine wasn't hit, but I knew we'd taken a penetration, and I knew what that meant. 15 seconds, maybe 20, before something caught fire. We had wet stowage, so maybe longer, but I wasn't taking chances. All 4 of us living crew were out through our hatches in less than 10 seconds. We took cover behind the tank, used it as a shield while we moved back to our lines. Morrison was dead, but we'd gotten everyone else out. The tank didn't burn. When we came back with recovery the next day, the tank was right where we left it. They patched the hole, replaced the equipment at Morrison's position, gave us a new gunner, and we had the same tank back in action 3 days later. Italian tankers serving with German units in northern Italy witnessed this engagement. They'd been positioned in reserve, expecting to be called forward if the American attack broke through. Instead, they watched through binoculars as knocked-out American tanks sat on the battlefield, their crews sheltering behind them, waiting for darkness to retreat. To men who'd been trained that a knocked-out tank was a tomb, this seemed impossible. They were using the destroyed tanks as cover, recalled Corporal Francesco Marino of a mixed Italian-German unit. In our training, we were taught that when your tank is hit, you evacuate and retreat immediately because the tank will burn. But the Americans were treating their knocked-out tanks like bunkers. They knew the tanks wouldn't burn, or wouldn't burn immediately, so they used them for protection. We would never do this with our M14S. If we stayed near a penetrated M14, we'd die when the ammunition exploded. The Americans had built their tanks to remain useful even after being knocked out. This wasn't a romantic exaggeration. American tactical doctrine explicitly taught crews to use disabled tanks as cover. The Sherman's armor, even when penetrated, still provided protection against small arms fire and shrapnel. If the tank hadn't caught fire, it would have become a steel fort. Italian doctrine taught the opposite. Distance yourself from a knocked-out tank immediately because it's about to explode. The doctrinal difference reflected design reality. An M14/41 hit by a penetrating round would, within 5 to 15 seconds, experience ammunition detonation or catastrophic fire in roughly 70% of cases. Staying near it was suicidal. A Sherman, especially a wet stowage model, might not catch fire at all. Even early dry Shermans with exposed ammunition took 30 to 60 seconds to reach catastrophic fire, giving crews time to evacuate and move to safety. The Americans had designed assuming failure, assuming their tanks would be hit and penetrated, and had built-in failure recovery mechanisms. The Italians had designed assuming success, assuming their tanks would destroy the enemy before being destroyed, and had no plan for when that assumption proved false. By the spring of 1945, as the war in Italy ground toward its conclusion, the surviving Italian tankers who'd witnessed this disparity understood something profound about industrial warfare. Modern combat wasn't about heroic stands or superior martial spirit. It was about systems, logistics, industrial capacity, and design philosophy. The Americans had built a system that kept crews alive, allowing them to accumulate experience, to crew multiple tanks, to train replacements effectively. They'd created a survival pipeline that turned tankers into a renewable resource. Italy had built tanks that consumed crews like ammunition one use, then gone. The German spring offensive of 1945 in Italy sputtered out in early April, followed by the massive Allied spring offensive that finally broke German resistance. When German forces in Italy surrendered unconditionally on May 2, 1945, they left behind hundreds of destroyed and abandoned tanks. Among them were the last M15 over 42 tanks, Italy's final indigenous tank design, still being operated by German and Italian Social Republic forces. American tank recovery crews, working through the wreckage, found 17 M15 42 seconds destroyed in the final battles. Examination showed the expected pattern: small hatches, riveted construction, exposed ammunition storage. Of the 17 tanks examined, 11 contained dead crew members. The recovery crews marked these tanks for burial detail rather than salvage. There was nothing worth salvaging from a tank designed to kill its own crew. The final accounting of Italian armoured forces during World War II makes for grim reading. Italy produced approximately 2,800 M13, M14 and M15 medium tanks between 1940 and 1943. Of these, perhaps 500 survived the war intact, mostly vehicles that never saw combat or were captured early and used by Allied forces for training. The remainder, over 2,000 tanks, were destroyed in combat, captured and subsequently destroyed, or abandoned and scrapped. Casualty figures for Italian tank crews remain incomplete. Official Italian army records were largely destroyed during the chaos following the armistice, and German records of Italian units serving alongside Wehrmacht forces are fragmentary. Conservative estimates suggest at least 6,000 Italian tankers died during the war, with perhaps 8,000 wounded seriously enough to be removed from service. Given that Italy fielded approximately 15,000 tank crewmen total across all units throughout the war, this represents a casualty rate exceeding 90%. American armoured forces, by comparison, fielded approximately 150,000 tank crew members across all theatres during World War II. Total tank crew deaths across all theatres, Europe, Mediterranean, Pacific, came to approximately 8,000. That's a casualty rate of approximately 5%. The disparity is almost too large to comprehend. Italian tankers were 18 times more likely to die than their American counterparts. Some of this difference reflects Italy's earlier exit from the war and the generally lower intensity of fighting they experienced compared to American forces in France and Germany during 1944 to 45. But even accounting for these factors, the death rate among Italian tankers remained 3 to 4 times higher than among American tankers facing comparable enemies in similar circumstances. The difference was the machine. An Italian tanker climbed into an M14 over 41, knowing that if his tank was hit and penetrated, he had perhaps a 1 in 3 chance of escaping alive. An American tanker climbed into a late-war Sherman, knowing that even if his tank was destroyed, he had better than even odds of walking away. That psychological difference manifested in combat effectiveness. Italian tankers fought bravely. Their courage was never in question, but they fought with the constant knowledge that their vehicle was a death trap. American tankers fought knowing their tank was survivable equipment. Post-war interviews with surviving Italian tankers reveal a consistent theme: betrayal. They felt betrayed by leadership that sent them into combat in inadequate vehicles. They felt betrayed by an industry that couldn't or wouldn't build better tanks. They felt betrayed by doctrine that treated them as expendable components rather than trained soldiers. Above all, they felt betrayed by a system that had the engineering knowledge to build better escape hatches, better fire suppression, better ammunition storage, but chose not to prioritize these features. "We knew," said Major Carlo Vitti, who'd commanded a company of M14 41 seconds in North Africa and survived 3 tanks being destroyed under him. "After the first battles, we knew our tanks were death traps." The junior officers wrote reports. "We told our commanders." The response was always the same: "This is the tank Italy has produced. These are the tanks you will fight in. Courage and initiative will overcome material deficiencies." But courage cannot open a hatch that is too small. Initiative cannot extinguish ammunition fires when there is no fire suppression system. We were being asked to overcome physics with willpower. Vitti's bitterness was shared by virtually every Italian tanker who survived the war. They'd watched American and British tankers' men fighting the same enemy, facing the same weapons, survive multiple tank knockouts that would have killed Italian crews. The Americans didn't survive because they were braver or better trained. They survived because their tanks were designed by engineers who'd thought about what happens when a 75mm shell penetrates armor at 2,000 meters per second. The Sherman wasn't a perfect tank. Its armor was inadequate against late-war German guns. Its 75mm gun struggled against Panther and Tiger frontal armor. It was tall, making it an easy target. It had mechanical issues. Some engine variants were unreliable. Early suspension systems wore quickly. The track design was prone to throwing under hard turns. American tankers called it the 33-ton coffin or death trap in moments of frustration. But when those same tankers were asked if they'd rather crew an M14 over 41 or even a German Panzer IV, the answer was universally no. The Sherman brought its crew home. That was worth more than thick armor or a powerful gun. That was worth everything. The broader lesson took decades to be fully understood. In the immediate post-war period, military analysts focused on the Sherman's combat shortcomings. Studies emphasized its inferior gun and armor compared to German tanks. The narrative became, American tanks were mediocre, only succeeding through numerical superiority and air support. This narrative ignored crew survivability entirely, as if keeping soldiers alive was somehow tangential to a tank's combat effectiveness. By the 1970s and 80s, as more complete records became available, and military historians began seriously studying crew casualty rates, the assessment shifted. The Sherman's survivability features, once dismissed as pleasant luxuries, were recognized as combat multipliers. A crew that survived one knockout could crew a replacement tank the next day. A crew that survived 3 knockouts had learned invaluable lessons about enemy tactics, terrain exploitation, and damage recognition. These lessons were passed to replacement crews, improving unit effectiveness across entire battalions. The Israeli military, operating upgraded Shermans well into the 1960s and 70s, explicitly valued the crew's survivability features. Israeli doctrine emphasized preserving trained crews above preserving vehicles. The Sherman's large hatches, multiple escape routes, and spacious interior aligned perfectly with this philosophy. When Israel finally retired its last Shermans in the late 1970s, some 35 years after the tank's initial design, Israeli tankers mourned not the vehicle's combat power, but its ability to bring crews home, alive from battles. Modern tank design has universally adopted the principles Americans stumbled toward in 1942 to 1944. Every modern main battle tank, the American M1 Abrams, German Leopard 2, British Challenger 2, Israeli Merkava, features large hatches for every crew member, multiple escape routes, blowout panels that direct ammunition explosions away from the crew, fire suppression systems, and spacious interiors that allow crew movement during combat. These features are now considered essential, not optional. The Italian experience serves as a cautionary tale. The M14 over 41 wasn't a bad tank because Italian engineers were incompetent. It was a bad tank because Italian military doctrine, industrial capacity, and institutional priorities created a vehicle that optimized for the wrong metrics. It is optimized for firepower and armor thickness while treating crew survivability as a secondary concern. This wasn't unique to Italy. German, Soviet, and British tanks of the early war period shared similar flaws. But Italy's industrial limitations meant they couldn't adapt and improve as other nations did. When American forces finally crossed the Po River in April 1945, effectively ending organized Axis resistance in Italy, they found one final cluster of destroyed M15 over 42 tanks near Ferrara. These were the last Italian-designed tanks to see combat, operated by Italian Social Republic forces still loyal to Mussolini's puppet government. Examination showed minor improvements over the M14/41, slightly thicker armor, a marginally better engine, but the fundamental flaws remained. Small hatches, riveted construction, exposed ammunition. One of these tanks had been penetrated by a single 75mm round from a Sherman. The entire crew had died inside. Beside this destroyed M15/42, American recovery crews found an abandoned Sherman, also knocked out but repairable. The crew had written in chalk on the turret side, "Third time lucky, crew alive." This Sherman had been penetrated twice before in earlier battles, repaired, and returned to service. Now destroyed a third time, it would likely be repaired again and given to another crew. The contrast was perfect. An Italian tank that consumed its only crew, and an American tank that had protected 3 successive crews and would likely protect a fourth. Lieutenant Rossetti, who'd examined that first Sherman near the Sangro River in November 1943, survived the war. He emigrated to Argentina in 1947, unable to reconcile himself with either the new Italian Republic or the memories of men he'd commanded who died in tanks that should never have been sent into combat. In letters to his sister, preserved in family archives, he reflected on his wartime service. "I think often about the American tank I examined," he wrote in 1952. "I spent perhaps 20 minutes inside that destroyed vehicle, studying how it was built, where everything was placed, trying to understand why their crew lived and so many of mine died. The answer was both simple and terrible. The Americans designed their tanks expecting them to be destroyed. They planned for failure and built in recovery mechanisms. We designed our tanks expecting them to win. We planned for success and had no contingency for defeat. In war, the side that plans for failure often succeeds because they survive their setbacks. The side that plans only for victory dies in its first defeat." Rossetti's reflection captures the essential irony. Italian martial tradition emphasized victory or death honorable combat, where defeat meant glorious sacrifice. American industrial pragmatism emphasized survival and recovery ignoble combat, where defeat meant tactical retreat and trying again tomorrow with better intelligence. The Italian approach produced inspiring poetry and devastating casualties. The American approach produced boring after-action reports and living veterans. The men who designed the Sherman engineers at Detroit Arsenal, Lima Locomotive Works, Fisher Body Division, Chrysler, Federal Machine and Welder weren't warriors. They were industrial designers solving production problems. How do we build 50,000 tanks in 3 years? How do we make them maintainable by average soldiers? How do we keep crews alive when things go wrong? These weren't romantic questions. They were practical engineering problems with practical solutions. Large hatches, floor escapes, backup power systems, fire extinguishers, relocated ammunition. The men who designed the M14/41 engineers at Ansaldo and Fiat were trying to build a weapon that could compete with British and French tanks using Italy's limited industrial resources. They succeeded at that narrow goal. The M14/41's 47mm gun was adequate, its armor was acceptable for 1940, and its engine was reliable. As a weapons platform evaluated in isolation, it was competent. As a vehicle for keeping Italian soldiers alive, it was catastrophic. This distinction between a weapon designed to fight versus a vehicle designed to protect its crew defined one of World War II's clearest lessons. Nations that treated tanks as expendable equipment and crews as valuable assets outperformed nations that treated tanks as sacred weapons and crews as expendable. The Sherman embodied the former philosophy. The M14/41 embodied the latter. By the war's end, the question of which tank was better became almost meaningless. Better at what? The Panther had a better gun. The Tiger had better armor. The T-34 had better mobility. But the Sherman brought its crew home. In the final accounting, when survival determines whether experience accumulates or dies with each battle, That might be the only metric that matters. The 20,000 American tankers who survived World War II after having their tanks destroyed underneath them, men who should have died by the calculus that killed Italian and German crews, went home, raised families, built careers, and told their grandchildren about the war. The 6,000 Italian tankers who died in vehicles designed without adequate thought for their survival left empty chairs, childless widows, and family lines that ended in burning metal on African and Italian battlefields. Lieutenant Rossetti understood this. Standing beside that destroyed Sherman in November 1943, examining the large hatches and floor escape, he'd grasped something that military leadership in Rome had never considered. The battle isn't won when your tank destroys the enemy. It's won when your tanker survives to fight tomorrow. The Americans had designed for tomorrow. Italy had designed for today. And in war, tomorrow always comes, but only for those who survive to see it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.